The house was old, older than any place they'd lived before. Its charm lay in its imperfections, the creak of the floorboards, the way the windows caught the light just so in the late afternoon. To the Wright family, it felt like a fresh start, a chance to leave the crowded city and its constant din. "It has character," Laura had said the day they moved in, her fingers brushing the edges of a carved banister worn smooth by decades of use. Her husband, Mark, agreed. Their teenage daughter, Clara, had been less enthused, but even she couldn't deny the house's intriguing pull. The basement was the last place they explored. A sturdy wooden door at the back of the kitchen led down a steep staircase into a cavernous room lit only by a bare bulb. Dust hung heavy in the air, illuminated by the faint yellow glow. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of unidentifiable substances and tools that seemed to belong to another era. "Creepy," Clara muttered as she trailed behind her parents, the floor cold beneath her socks. Near the far corner, beneath a rusted pipe, they found the box. It was tucked neatly under an old table, its edges frayed with age, as though it had been waiting for them. Mark opened it, coughing as a plume of dust rose. "Home movies?" Laura asked, pulling out a reel of film. Each reel was labeled in blocky handwriting. Ceremony, Summer '74, Autumn Gathering, and Winter Light. At the bottom of the box was an old projector, its metal frame scratched but intact. That evening, they decided to watch one. Mark set up the projector in the living room, while Clara and Laura sat cross-legged on the couch. As the film sputtered to life, the whir of the reel filled the silence. The footage began innocuously enough. A group of people, smiling and waving, gathered in what appeared to be the very basement they'd just explored. The walls, the shelves, even the old pipe. It was unmistakable. "This is our house," Laura whispered, her voice tinged with unease. The people on screen were dressed oddly, their clothes outdated even for the 1970s. Long cloaks, wide-brimmed hats, and strange necklaces that glinted in the dim light. They were setting up a table in the center of the room, arranging candles and a large, unfamiliar book. The scene shifted abruptly. The smiles were gone. The group stood in a circle, their heads bowed as if in prayer. The film had no sound, but the expressions on their faces were almost too intense, reverent, yet strained. The camera zoomed in on the book, its pages scrawled with intricate symbols and text. "I don't like this," Clara murmured, inching closer to her mother. Laura nodded. "Mark, maybe..." But the reel ended before she could finish, the screen going blank with a soft clack. "What was that?" Clara asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and discomfort. "Probably some eccentric hobby," Mark offered, though his brow furrowed. "People were into all kinds of weird stuff back then." Yet something lingered in the room, a faint sense of unease that refused to dissipate. That night, as Clara lay in bed, she could swear she heard faint creaking below, too deliberate to be the house settling. She told herself it was her imagination and pulled the covers tighter. The next morning brought a pale light through the windows, filtering weakly into the living room. Laura was the first to notice the difference. "Did anyone touch the furniture?" she asked, staring at the armchair near the window. "No," Mark replied, stepping into the room with a mug of coffee. "Why?" Laura frowned, running her fingers over the chair's fabric. "I could have sworn it was facing the fireplace last night." Clara, shuffling into the room with her phone in hand, paused mid-scroll. "Maybe you moved it when we set up the projector." "Maybe," Laura said, though her voice held doubt. That evening, curiosity won over hesitation, and they decided to watch another reel. This one was labeled Autumn Gathering. The projector hummed to life, casting flickering light across the walls. The footage was darker, the room lit only by the glow of a dozen candles. The same group from before was seated around the table, their faces obscured by shadow. In the center of the table was an arrangement of objects, an ornate dagger, a bowl of what appeared to be herbs, and a large, cracked mirror. The camera focused on the mirror, which reflected not just the room, but something else, shapes that flickered and moved, too indistinct to identify. "Turn it off," Laura said suddenly, her voice sharp. "Why? It's just—" "Turn it off," she repeated, her hand on Mark's shoulder. He stopped the reel. The projector's hum died, but the silence that followed was worse. "What's wrong?" Clara asked, her voice quiet. "I don't know," Laura admitted, glancing toward the hallway. "It just felt wrong." They cleaned up in uneasy silence, each retreating to their rooms earlier than usual. That night, Clara dreamed of the basement. She saw the table from the videos, but it was no longer empty. On it lay the cracked mirror, glowing faintly. Behind her, shadowed figures gathered, their faces just out of focus. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she noticed something. Her desk chair, which had been neatly tucked in, was now pulled out and turned toward her bed. She didn't sleep again that night. The basement had become a fixation. Though none of them said it aloud, the tapes had anchored their attention to that cold, shadowy space. Clara felt its pull most strongly. That morning, as sunlight barely filtered through the gray clouds, she stood at the top of the basement stairs, staring down into the gloom. "You shouldn't go down there alone," Laura's voice startled her. Clara turned, her hand still on the railing. "I just wanted to look around. I can't stop thinking about the stuff in those tapes." Laura hesitated, then sighed. "We should all look together. Mark's gone into town," Clara interrupted. "It's fine, Mom. I won't touch anything." Her mother frowned but didn't stop her as Clara descended the narrow steps, her footsteps echoing on the worn wood. The basement was colder than she remembered, the air dense and still. The box of tapes sat where they'd left it, but Clara's attention drifted to the walls. They were rough and unpainted, speckled with patches of discoloration. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed something strange. Carvings. She stepped closer, brushing her fingers against the surface. The grooves were shallow but deliberate, forming jagged symbols that snaked along the wall's surface. Most were abstract, loops and angular shapes, but one stood out. A circle encasing a pattern of intersecting lines, with what looked like an eye in the center. Clara shivered. Her hand lingered on the symbol, and for a moment, she thought she heard something. A faint whisper, low and unintelligible, emanating from deep within the basement. She stepped back quickly, her heart racing. "Clara!" Laura's voice called from upstairs. "I'm coming!" she yelled, the sound bouncing back at her. She glanced once more at the carved eye, before hurrying up the stairs. That evening, Mark returned with groceries, his cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. They sat down to dinner, exchanging small talk that felt forced. Halfway through the meal, Clara spoke. "There are carvings on the basement walls." Mark frowned. "What kind of carvings?" "Symbols," she said, her voice steady but tinged with unease. One looked like an eye. Laura stiffened, her fork clattering against her plate. "You didn't touch them, did you?" "No," Clara lied, her gaze dropping to her lap. Mark's brow furrowed. "Probably graffiti from the previous owners. They seemed a little eccentric." "Eccentric doesn't explain those tapes," Laura muttered. An uneasy silence fell over the table. Finally, Mark stood and began clearing the plates, his cheerful facade cracking under the weight of their shared anxiety. That night they heard the whispering. Clara was the first to wake, the faint sound pulling her from an uneasy sleep. She sat up, straining to identify its source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a low hum punctuated by faint syllables she couldn't understand. She crept to her bedroom door, opening it slowly. The hallway was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight spilling through the window. As she stepped out, she saw her parents' door open too. Laura stood in the doorway, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" Clara nodded, her pulse quickening. Together they followed the sound, which grew louder as they descended the stairs. Mark joined them part-way, his expression tense. The three of them stopped at the basement door, the whispers seeping through like mist. Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "Should we?" Laura shook her head. Not tonight. The following morning, Clara awoke to find her parents in the living room, their faces etched with exhaustion. The box of tapes sat on the coffee table, the reels strewn about. "What's going on?" Clara asked, her voice hoarse. Mark rubbed his temples. "We woke up to the sound of the projector running." Clara's stomach dropped. "It was playing a reel we hadn't watched yet," Laura added, her voice unsteady. "None of us started it." Clara stepped closer. "What was on it?" Her parents exchanged a glance. Finally, Laura spoke. "The same people, but different. They weren't doing rituals anymore. They were sitting in a circle, staring into that cracked mirror. And in the mirror—" "What?" Clara pressed. Mark's voice was grim. It wasn't just their reflections. There were other shapes moving behind them. Shadows. Clara felt a chill creep down her spine. Despite their fear, they decided to watch the remaining reels that evening. The projector flickered to life, bathing the room in shifting light. The film showed the group again, but now the rituals were frantic. They moved quickly, their hands trembling as they lit candles and scrawled symbols on the basement floor. The camera panned to the mirror, which now glowed faintly, its cracked surface shimmering. The air around the group seemed to ripple, and the shadows in the mirror grew darker, more distinct. Then the reel ended. Silence filled the room, heavy and oppressive. "What do we do?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. "We finish watching," Mark said firmly. The next reel began, but the footage was distorted. The camera shook, its lens catching glimpses of the basement in chaos. Candles toppled, the mirror lay shattered, and the group stood frozen, their faces masks of terror. Then, for a brief moment, the camera focused on the far wall. Clara gasped. It was the same symbol she'd seen carved into the basement, the eye encased in a circle. But this time it seemed to pulsate, as if alive. The reel cut to black. "Why is this happening?" Laura whispered. Clara stared at the projector, her mind racing. "I think the house is trying to show us something." As the room fell silent, the whispering returned, louder than ever. The whispering filled the house now, seeping through the walls like an unwelcome presence. It didn't stop, even in the daylight, though it ebbed and flowed, rising to a fever pitch whenever the family approached the basement door. By the second day, Clara could barely think. Her dreams were consumed by the symbols, the glowing mirror, and the shadowed figures. Every time she woke, the whispering seemed louder, as if the house knew she was growing weaker. "We can't stay here," Laura said firmly, her voice trembling. "We have to leave." Mark nodded, though his face was pale. "We'll go tomorrow morning. We just need a plan." The words felt hollow. Clara knew it wasn't that simple. The house didn't want them to leave. It had been pulling them in since the first tape. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the muffled sound of whispers swirling around her like fog. A faint scratching drew her attention to her desk. She froze. The chair had moved again, its back turned toward her. But this time, there was something on the desk, an object that hadn't been there before. Slowly, Clara sat up and turned on her bedside lamp. The object gleamed faintly under the light. It was a shard of glass, its edges jagged and faintly iridescent. The mirror. Her breath caught in her throat as a faint glow emanated from the shard. She didn't dare touch it, but the whispers grew louder, sharper, as if urging her to act. Summoning her courage, Clara slipped out of bed and tiptoed to her parents' room. They were awake, sitting tensely on the edge of the bed, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of Mark's phone. "Mom, Dad," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not going to let us go unless we do something." Laura looked at her daughter with wide, fearful eyes. "What are you talking about?" Clara took a shaky breath. "The house, the mirror. It's showing us the past because it needs us to finish something." Mark frowned. "Finish what?" "The ritual," Clara said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "That's why the tapes keep playing. That's why the symbols are on the walls. They started something down there and it never ended." Silence fell over the room, broken only by the ever-present whispering. "We can't," Laura began, but Clara interrupted. "If we don't, it won't stop. It'll never stop." Together they descended into the basement, the glow of a single flashlight guiding their way. The air was stifling, thick with an oppressive energy that made Clara's skin prickle. The carvings on the walls seemed more prominent now, their lines faintly glowing. At the center of the room, where the table in the videos had once stood, was a faint outline of the circle and eye symbol etched into the floor. "This is it," Clara whispered. "What do we do?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible. Clara hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out the shard of mirror. It gleamed faintly, its glow syncing with the symbols on the wall. "We place it in the circle," she said, her voice trembling. Laura grabbed her arm. "What if this makes things worse?" "It's already worse," Clara replied, her gaze steady despite the fear in her voice. Reluctantly, Laura released her, and Clara stepped forward. She knelt at the edge of the circle and placed the shard at its center. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air shifted. The whispering rose to a crescendo, the symbols on the walls flaring with light. The shard pulsed, and the room seemed to twist around them, the air shimmering like heat waves. A low hum filled the basement, vibrating in their bones. The light from the shard grew brighter, and for an instant, Clara thought she saw something in it. A figure, cloaked and indistinct, staring back at her. Then, as quickly as it began, the light dimmed, and the room fell silent. The whispering was gone. The next morning, the house felt different. The air was lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. The carvings on the walls had faded, their lines barely visible. Clara stood in the living room, staring out the window at the pale winter sun. She didn't understand what had happened, but she felt, deep in her gut, that they had done what the house needed. Mark and Laura joined her, their faces still marked with exhaustion, but softened with relief. "Are we safe now?" Laura asked. Clara nodded. "I think so." They packed their belongings that day, and by evening, the house stood empty once more. As the family drove away, Clara glanced back at the house. It looked ordinary now, its weathered exterior bathed in the fading light. But in the basement, hidden in the shadows, the shard of mirror lay undisturbed. Its faint glow pulsed once, then faded into darkness.